This program is brought to you by Bible Way Media, overseen by the elders of the Chipman Road Church of Christ in Lee Summit, Missouri. Thank you for joining us today here on Coffee with Zach and Russ. Hello again. We do want to welcome everyone back to Coffee with Zach and Russ. We thank you for being here with us today. Our lesson today is going to center around really Matthew chapter 27, looking at this is based off of a lesson which I've done recently entitled "The Day Everything Changed." But I like doing this as a podcast because when you have someone else here, like Brother Zach, there's other things that are brought out that aren't usually discussed, during the sermon or something like that. And so it's like the Bible says, two heads are better than one. Mm-hmm. And so it's nice to use these outlines and to talk about it more when we don't have that Sunday morning sermon timeline restraint, so to speak. Matthew chapter 27 is a very interesting chapter. You can cross-reference it also with chapter 15 in Mark and chapter 23 in Luke as well. But if you find there in Matthew chapter 27, it begins there in verse 1 by saying, "When morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death." Now, Matthew 27 centers around the events of Christ's death. And every gospel account is a little bit different, like I mentioned there with Mark and Luke. And actually, this is also mentioned there in John 18, about verse 28. But the events in Matthew 27, and we're going to just summarize this because our focus isn't going to be primarily on just the sacrifice of Christ. It's going to be looking at the idea of him taking our place. But if you look there at Matthew 27, and I'm going to summarize some of this, and I'll let Brother Zach talk. But Matthew 27, 1 and 2 says, "When the morning came, all the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate, the governor." And what always stands out to me is the people who did this. In Matthew 27, verse 1, it says, "The chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus." And then it tells us what they were plotting was they're going to put him to death. And it's mind boggling to think about quote unquote religious people getting together to figure out how they're going to kill this man. It is a level of evil that we can only, many times imagine. We have evil depicted in movies and things with different characters and those kinds of things. But with these religious leaders, and we'll talk more about this later when we talk about Judas as well, but they are supposed to be the people who others could go to talk to and to help them in a religious or quote unquote spiritual sense. But it's these very people who are plotting against him. And the Bible tells us there in verse 2 how they were going to deliver him to Pilate because, of course, they could not have him put to death. The Romans would be the ones who would do that. And so, anyway, that's just something that really stands out to me there with the chief priests and the elders. And I'm going to stop there and let Brother Zach add anything you like as we look at this the day that everything changed.
You think about these chief priests, you think about these elders, and what's interesting as you study the life of Christ, initially these two groups of individuals, they had the mindset that they wanted to put Jesus to death, but they weren't working together. They were kind of doing their own thing. And it's not until John chapter number 11, after you have, of course, the resurrection of Lazarus, it's after that time where you see the scribes, the high priest and the Pharisees really come together to really determine that they're going to crucify Jesus. As a matter of fact, if you look over at John chapter 11, and this is fresh in my mind because we've been going through this at Olathe for one of our adult Bible classes, but you even look at the end of John chapter 11, verse 56, just to give you some insight into these individuals. It says they sought Then sought they for Jesus, and spake among themselves as they stood in the temple, What think ye, that he will not come to the feast? Now both the chief priests and the Pharisees had given commandment that if any man knew where he were, he should show it, that they might take him. Well, when you look in verse number 56, they sought him. In the Greek, and I'm not too big into the Greek, but that's a continuous action. They were seeking for him. They did not stop seeking for him. And they had even given the commandment, if anyone knows where Jesus is, you need to tell us. And so that's the mindset of these people that we have here in Matthew chapter 27. We mentioned verses 1 and 2, but you look on in at verses 3 through 4, and you see other character aspects that they had. It says, Then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself, and brought again the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned, and that I have betrayed the innocent blood. And they said, What is that to us? See thou to that. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple, and departed, and went and hanged himself. And so their bloodlust for Jesus is so strong that here comes Judas with what appears to be a remorseful attitude, saying, what I've done is wrong. I want to make these things right. And they don't even care. That's the type of people that we see here on the onset of Matthew chapter number 27. Now, I give a little spoiler alert. It's going to be those same people that Jesus is going to die for. And I'll let Brother Russ take it from there.
And that's exactly right. That's what I was going to bring out as well. And when I did this lesson on Sunday morning, I brought this up as well. Can you imagine going to one of your elders or a deacon or just another member in the church and saying that, you have sinned and maybe you want someone to pray with you, pray for you, those kinds of things, which is really in essence what Judas is doing. He's wanting to return these things. He's remorseful. But the problem is he goes to the wrong people. Mm-hmm. And the things he said, there are things that they say to him. I can imagine saying that to someone he's wanting to who is remorseful, right? And like Zach pointed out there, when they say there in verse 4, and they said, what is that to us? You see to it. Basically, they're saying that's all on you. That's none of me. And I gave the illustration how years ago when I worked in the rent-to-own business, and we would have to go to collect people's items and they weren't paying on, those kinds of things. The part of the business you really didn't want to do. And a number of times we heard things like that. People saying, that's not me. That had nothing to do with me. That's my partner. That's my sometimes even spouse or whatever. That's not me. And so basically saying that's not my fault or I have nothing to do with that. And that's pretty much what the elders here and these chief priests are doing, right? And they said, what is that to us? What you're feeling, that has nothing to do with us. That's all on you, right? You see to it. And then he responds by throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple. He ran out and then he hanged himself. It is a very, very sad day to see those kinds of things transpire. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that happens in Matthew 27. And one brother said, we were talking about this afterwards. He said, you almost feel sorry for Judas because it seems like he didn't realize. I mean, he has his own problems. There's no doubt about it. But when he says there in verse 3, he says, then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, the idea there being he's seeing that he was going to be put to death. It almost sounds like Judas didn't think they were going to kill the man. Maybe they thought, well, he's going to, they're going to put him in prison for a couple of weeks or something, and no physical harm would come to him. Maybe, who knows exactly, but it seems there in verse 3 that he was not realizing the extent what was going to happen. And he Bible says there, as the New King James says, was remorseful. I think the King James says he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. And Judas, I mean, this was an incredible day. But we can learn a lot from Judas. And that is, one, we need to realize that every action we have has consequences or has repercussions, whether it be good or bad. And Judas, no doubt, was remorseful in this. But then the mentality that the chief priests and the elders was one that was, they had a, like Brother Zach was saying, they wanted to kill Christ, right? I mean, that's their main focus. They care about nothing else so long as Christ was dead. And I remember when I think about this, I think about when I talk about Cain and Abel and how when Cain killed his brother Abel and how that was a special kind of hate you can't even begin to imagine, killing your own flesh and blood. And then we have here the chief priests and elders having this, what I call again, that special kind of hate where they're going to ignore Judas, they're going to use him, cast him aside, and then focus only on Christ being killed. And the idea of him hanging himself, killing himself, it would seem from the text that I really doubt the chief priests and elders cared one bit. And so a lot transpired here. And I'm going to pause there and let Brother Zach add anything you like. And as we move into this next section, looking at the necessity of Christ's death and some other things as well. So I'm going to go ahead and let Brother Zach take it from there.
Yeah, I'd say you're absolutely right that they really could have cared less about what Judas did, because even after they, after Judas throws the silver down and they leave, the chief priests, they take the silver pieces. And this is what always, I guess, I'm trying to intrigues me, I guess, is that these individuals were trying to proclaim that they were righteousness. Now, what I mean by that is you look at what they did here. They said, well, we can't have this money because it's blood money. And so we're going to put it into the treasury. You can't do that in the treasury because it's blood money. So we're going to go out and we're going to buy this field with it. But in the same breath, they're ready to kill Jesus. And so you see the hypocrisy within these people. And man, it's just so sad. And so that brings about really to the next talking point that, we really have to talk about when we deal with Matthew chapter 27. It is the death of Christ. And we have to understand from the onset that Christ's death was a necessity. Sometimes I'll hear brethren say, and I'm not sure if they truly are thinking about this statement when they say it, that, God could have saved mankind any other way. He just chose to use his son. I wish people would think about that statement. If God could have saved us any other way but chose to use his son, does that not make him a cruel God? Mm-hmm. Does that not, you think about a father-son relationship, as you would see Jesus in the garden praying prior to this, Father, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. If there's any other way that we can save mankind, let's do that. And of course, we know Jesus says, not my will be done, but thine be done. And so Jesus is going to go on and be crucified. But we really had to consider that, there was no other way. The Hebrew writer brings that out in Hebrews chapter 10, that the blood and bulls and goats could never take away our sin. And of course, there's other passages that we could look at. But we have to understand, the world needs to understand that Christ's death was a necessity. It was a necessity to save all mankind, even the scribes and the Pharisees, who were going to be the ones that would ultimately bring about the death of Christ. And, I'll make this point and then I'll let Russ kind of take it from there. But you look at the history of Israel, and you look at how they would try to go from this God to that God, or to this thing or to that thing, and none of those gods could do anything for them. Currently this week, by the time that this podcast actually comes out, this event will be over. But currently this week at Olathe, we're doing VBS. We're looking at God. And tonight, on Tuesday night, we're going to be looking at Elijah on top of Mount Carmel, battling the prophets of Baal. And it's there that Elijah brings all of Israel together, and then he says, listen, how long stand ye halt between two opinions? If Jehovah be God, serve him. If Baal be God, serve him. And then, of course, there's that battle that ensues that ultimately shows that Jehovah is the true God. And despite everything that Israel did, God's going to be the only one that can bring about salvation, and it's going to be by the necessity of the death of his son.
In that story there, like you said, there with Elijah and the contest there, that is probably one of my favorite stories or accounts, we should say, of the Old Testament. It's one of those things that kind of get you fired up when you read through there. It's a great lesson, and like Brother Zach was alluding to here a moment ago, talking about how these individuals have at times gone after other gods, which leads us into this point here in 2 Kings chapter 19, where we find we were reminded how they had tried other gods. And I compare that today to how sometimes, if we don't realize it, that we may not quote unquote try other gods, but we try to do things our own way. And I will tell you, I am not a handyman. My handyman skills are extremely limited. When we moved into our new place, I changed, installed some ceiling fans and things, and I was proud I did that because nothing fell down, nothing caught on fire, but I knew my limits. I knew I couldn't do everything, and I think spiritually speaking, we have to realize that we have to know our limits. We can pray. We need to pray to God. We need to keep Him as our focus. Realize that we cannot do everything, and in fact, the Bible tells us that without Him, we can do nothing. Christ tells us that. But in 2 Kings 19, we were reminded how Israel had tried over the years, quote unquote, tried different gods. And what we mean by gods, we mean that in lowercase g. They had tried they tried idols. In verse 17 and 18 of 2 Kings 19 says, Truly, the kings of Assyria have laid waste the nations in their lands and have cast their gods, that's a little g, into the fire, for they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore, they destroyed them. They were created by man. And I love how the text is so clear in that it includes here this idea in verse 18. And he says, "For they were not gods, and he shows us what they were, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone." He says, "Therefore, they destroyed them." Why? Because they were not gods. They were not anything. They could provide literally nothing for them. None of their gods, so-called gods, could save them. None of them could provide for them. They could do absolutely nothing. In fact, they wouldn't even exist for them to, quote-unquote, exist, for them to worship until they created them. How sad is that? But yet sometimes today, we may not have an idol on our mantle. Sometimes we too can be guilty of following after things which we ought not to be following. And I'm going to let Brother Zach make one more point on this. When we look at the necessity of Christ's death, there's a verse here we have marked. I'm going to let him discuss that if he'd like. Before we move on, as I know our time is the clock never stops, and sometimes that's pretty annoying. But I'm going to let Brother Zach add anything he'd like here so we can continue looking at Christ's death being that necessity.
Yeah, and I want to add just an additional point, because you mentioned 2 Kings there, chapter 19, and it talks about Israel went after all of these gods that they had to make with their own hands. And of course, anytime I think about that, my mind always goes to Isaiah, right? Isaiah chapter number 44 there you start in verse number 14, and it says, He heweth him down cedars and taketh the cypress and the oak, which he strengthened for himself among the trees of the forest. He planteth an ash, and the rain doth nourish it. Then shall it be for a man to burn, for he will take thereof and warm himself. Yea, kindleth it and bake bread. Yea, he maketh a god and worshipeth it. He maketh it a graven image and falleth down therefore to it. He burneth part thereof in the fire, and part thereof he eateth flesh. He roasteth the roast, and it satisfy him. Yet he warmeth himself and say, I see more. I have seen fire. Do you see the silliness of this? Isaiah is saying, here's the man. He goes out, he cuts down a tree, he takes a third of it, he builds a fire with it, he takes another third of it, and he bakes the bread with it, and then he takes whatever's left and he worships it. How foolish is that? And then you consider, of course, the result of doing these foolish things, as we see in Joshua chapter number 23 and verse number 16. Notice what the text says here. Joshua 23, verse 16, when ye have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods, and bowed yourselves to them, then shall the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and ye shall perish quickly from off the good land which he hath given you. And so here you have the sadness of Israel following after all these gods. You have the foolishness of Israel following after all these gods. And God had already told them that when you do that, I'm going to punish you. You go back to Exodus chapter number 20, and again in Deuteronomy chapter number 5, as those 10 commandments are given. God says from the very onset, you're going to have no other gods before me. You're not going to bow down to any graven image. Why? Because I am a jealous God. And so the children of Israel, of course, were punished for their betrayal of God. They were punished for their sins. And so Christ's death then is going to be necessary to help bring Israel and all mankind then back to God. And that's where we see a true sacrifice. And I'll let Brother Russ pick up from that point.
And that's exactly right, which we'll have to look at this next time. But when we think about the necessity of Christ, we think of the necessity of his death, and we'll next time look at the true sacrifice of Christ. There's so much for us to think about when we think about everything that God has done for us through his Son. And it should help us remember where our loyalties lie, where our faith is, where our trust is. And you look at Matthew 27, it's a reminder of where Judas, look where his trust was. For a time, it was in money. He was even walking alongside Christ. What did he do? The Bible says he still took from the money box.
That's right.
And so we do not want to be like that. We want to make sure we realize where our trust should be, where our faith is, and realize all the things that Christ has done for us. And if we will put our obedient faith in him, everything else will work out just fine. Maybe not as the world thinks it should, but the world doesn't even know what bathroom to use anymore, so we won't go down that road. But no, we have to put our faith where it really belongs, in someone who actually cares about us. And I'm gonna let Brother Zach add any final comments he'd like before we close out here today.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful point. Put our faith in someone that has done so many things for us and continues to do everything for us. And the beauty of this study, and obviously we have more to say, but go and read Matthew chapter 27 and consider the sacrifice of Christ, and consider how that changed everything. And it's a beautiful thought that we serve a loving God who was willing to do that for mankind, when, as we've looked at, mankind clearly didn't care. The scribes and the Pharisees didn't care. Israel of old didn't care. And yet Christ still willingly went to the cross. No greater love hath a man showed than to lay down his life, as we see in John chapter number 15. And that should be something that should encourage us, to be faithful and obedient to him.
Thank you, Brother Zach. Well said. And we appreciate everyone being here with us today. We hope you've enjoyed our program. When we come back next time, we'll continue looking at this idea of the day that everything changed, picking up, looking at Christ's death and how it was a true sacrifice. We hope to see you again next time. We thank you for joining us today. We hope you have enjoyed this program. You can find out more about Byway Media by visiting us at bywaymedia.org. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find all of our podcasts on all major podcast platforms. As always, we thank you for listening.